Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I just wanted to go over one housekeeping item. During this webinar, if you have questions, you may type them in the question box, which is located on the right-hand side of your screen. At this time, I'd like to introduce Margie Nolan, the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Funeral Directors Association. Welcome, Margie.
Thanks, Kelly. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's session, Cremation. The answer is in the numbers, on behalf of the other Northeast Funeral Service Partnership states of Connecticut, New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania. Our partnership was created to leverage the power of collaboration for funeral service professionals here in the Northeast. Another overwhelming response to this second program offering is a validation of that goal. This program has been approved for CEU and/or APFSP credits, so please refer to the information that was sent by your state association. I'm excited to introduce our seminar leader, Barbara Kemmis, Executive Director of the Cremation Association of North America. I'm sure you have read Barbara's impressive credentials in our marketing materials, and I wanted to add some observations. First, many of us recognize Barbara as our nation's leading expert and a thought leader on everything cremation, basing her advice on highly respected research coupled with her extensive experience. I also wanted you to know about the amount of support she provided to many of our state associations here in the Northeast during the very difficult days of the pandemic. We were confident in the data, information, and advice that she shared, which enabled us to better serve you. Barbara and Kana are highly valued and respected resources. Let's get started. Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you, Margie. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. It was really a pleasure to work with you, if you can say that about, there wasn't much pleasurable about the last year, but thank you. We're going to go over a lot of the research that Margie referenced. But first, let me start and introduce myself a little. I'm Barbara Kemmis, of course, Executive Director, but I'm a librarian by trade, and that is what has spurred my love of research. I've actually done more library work, I think, and reference work as Executive Director of Kana as I did when I was working in library associations and in libraries before then. So research is really my favorite part of what we do with Kana, and it's one of the two things that we're best known for. The other, of course, being our crematory operations certification program. And like other associations, we have members, we have member benefits, we have educational programming, etc. But what Kana was founded in 1913 to be is a trade organization where cemeteries, funeral homes, suppliers, everybody comes together because they believe that cremation is preparation for memorialization. So we're very much a specialized association. I can't see you, but I imagine there are members on this webinar for whom your state association is your primary affiliation. And what have we learned over the last 18 months, if not how important state associations are? They're lobbying for you, they're speaking for you, they're convening you to learn. Kana is proud to be everybody's second or even third association behind state associations. So that's where we fit into the environment here. Now today I'm going to talk about Kana research, and I invite your questions. And at any time you can put those questions into the question box, and I'll pause at various points to answer those for you. There have been 4 studies over the past 5 years that I'm going to touch on, and we're talking about, cremation, which a lot of people feel is a challenge or a threat. I'm hoping a number of you are shaking your hands. Not me, we figured cremation out. But in case you're still concerned about cremation and all the things that go along with that, which normally boils down to profitability, we're going to touch on some research that we've done that can help you understand some trends and things that can help you build your business. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the pandemic. Then we're going to go into our annual statistics report, which was released 2 months ago at this point. And then we'll talk about two studies that were done a little bit further, a little bit longer ago, but go as to trends to why cremation is being chosen and what can we learn about the experience people have when they choose cremation. So first, the pandemic. Margie mentioned that early on in the pandemic, we did some research related to what are these numbers? Why are crematories at max capacity? How can we track this? How can we prepare? How can we, Cana was as helpful as we could be, but the state associations led that. And so in November, we published a study. We looked at 15 states where we got 6 months of their death and cremation numbers between March and September. So the first, what we euphemistically thought, the first part of the pandemic that would end soon thereafter. But what we discovered is during that period, there was a 2.74% average increase in cremation. And to put this in context, we haven't seen a higher than 2% annual increase in a cremation rate ever. I mean, ever in the history of anything. So we saw that and we thought, wow, cremation is really, the pandemic is really pointing people toward cremation in a really big way. And we're going to see jumps, not just in the numbers of cremation, but the actual proportion of dispositions that end in cremation. We saw Nevada, a state that was already close to 80% cremation, jump over 1%. They don't have that much more to grow. And then we saw New Jersey during that time period increase 3.5%. For those of you living through that time period, you remember how many more cremations, how many more families you were serving, but also how many more were choosing cremation at that point. So, but it turns out when we looked at the annual data this spring, it annualized, it evened out a bit. And now these are national numbers that I'm showing you here. And this chart gives you a look at 5-year increments. So if you look 4 lines down, you'll see 2020, the cremation rate was 56.1% nationally. And if you look at the bottom row, that's only a 1.5% annual increase. And that's exactly what we projected, exactly what we expected. So all in all, 2020, the cremation growth rate was predictable, as it turned out. So it was a little anticlimactic in a way, given what we saw, but also reassuring that in a time of turmoil, well, some things stay the same. The cremation rate grew predictably. But there's more to investigate with this. So this is a map that we often, they'll be familiar to you, that Cana produces and we put on our website. It gets posted everywhere. It's a heat map showing the cremation rates across the country. And of course, I have Canada here too. So that 56.1% cremation and 1.8 million cremations is the number that turned out to be. But you look at the map and you see, wow, it's very regional, where these higher cremation rates are and these lower cremation rates. But even in the Northeast, even in the Midwest, where the cremation rates have been a little bit behind the national rate, they're slowly but steadily increasing. There's only one purple state left, right, with a cremation rate below 30%, and that's changing. So keep this map in mind as we go forward, as you and find your own state on here, obviously, to see where you fit. Instead of publishing, or in addition to publishing the maps, we also created an infographic, and this is on our website and available. Oh, and let me pause for a second to say, for those of you who are note takers like me, I've given a PDF of these slides to each of your associations, so you will get them as a handout. So you don't have to, I'm going to go kind of quickly, and I don't want you to scramble and have to write these numbers down. All right. Actually, it looks like you might be able to download them from here. So this infographic shows what you experienced last year in numbers, and it's staggering. It's staggering. We consumers, who working remotely from the safety of our homes, heard the numbers: 500,000 excess deaths, all of these things, all of these numbers, and it didn't make any sense. I talked to Cana members and others who were calling in, and we convened our members at various points when things changed and when new information came about. And all we could hear about was how busy everybody was. In the beginning, it was you all. The first wave was in the Northeast and, of course, in Washington State. By the end of the year, everybody across the country had experienced their own surge. And all of that is demonstrated in this infographic. The 1.8 million cremations, 3.358 million deaths. That's such a huge increase over prior year. And no wonder you were busy. And I thank you. I thank you so much for stretching yourself to the limit and serving all of these families and finding a way to do that. I can't thank you enough. So if no one's thanked you recently, now you have been. But these numbers, are astonishing. And so I'm going to move on to focus on the region, but I think this is something that I sincerely hope is unprecedented. And that's a word that's been overused during the pandemic, but I sincerely hope that we never see a year like this again. So as we look at regional comparisons, and please note, depending on the screen you're looking at, these might be hard to take in. So I recommend looking for your state and then going across that row to find your state. These are comparisons of 2019 to 2020. And so the first chart in the upper left talks about total numbers of cremations and deaths. And then the second chart, percentages. And I'm sorry, there we go. And so you can see how the cremation growth changed so dramatically in these numbers. So yeah, your calls were up. And in the chart on the lower right, what I did was I showed percentage growth. And the US is the last line here. So the percentage growth varies, but most of the states are kind of in line with the United States with cremation growth, right? A little up for deaths, but you were hit hard at the very beginning. The outliers here are New York and especially New Jersey. But let me take a moment to say that regarding methodology, the numbers that you see here are based on death certificates, but they're also based on occurrence versus residence. And that's an important difference. Many states report both ways, but Cana has always accumulated data based on occurrence, so we don't accidentally double count people who the death occurred in Florida, but they resided in New Jersey. So it can be double counted if you mix up occurrence versus resident deaths. We've always done occurrence, and of course we know that New Jersey had more cremations. Largely because there were New York deaths, right? That you, in addition to New Jersey deaths that you cremated. So those numbers and percentages would probably even out and look differently if we were presenting residence data. But still, it's a lot, and you were busy. So that's looking past. Let's look to the future a bit. Now, we struggled a bit this year with our algorithm and projecting into the future because the cremation rate is already over 50% nationally. And so we're in a deceleration phase. We're exiting rapid growth and into a deceleration phase. Cremation rate growth should slow down. It shouldn't be 1.5% year over year. It should slow down quite a bit. And for an eventual plateau of, say, 80%. We really don't know. There are some provinces in Canada that are at 90%. British Columbia is at 90% cremation rate. So an average national plateau is likely, we think, to be 80%, but some areas and certainly some local regions could be higher. And so the thing I want to point out here is these are our projections, or the actual rate for 2020 and our projections for 2025 and 2030. You write them down, think about them as for your business planning, but know that they're just projections. There's many demographic and other changes that could happen that could move these, but if any, if anything I've learned is Cana tends to be more conservative in our projections than others. So the numbers could well be higher. But the one reassurance I will leave with you is the picture, the bar chart in the bottom corner. Again, find your state and you can see that each state follows a similar pattern. So you can see if your numbers person, I'm just displaying the numbers in a graphic, and the picture, the pattern is what's key. We're not anticipating any huge spikes or jumps. It's going to be slow and steady growth in cremation. Connecticut's a little bit higher. I looked into that a little bit to see, and Connecticut, as this is high level, generally speaking, is less diverse than other states, has a higher population over 65, and those are demographics that tend to point toward higher cremation rates, actually. So lower adherence to Christianity. I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll cover that in a minute. But this picture of slow and steady growth really supports planning. So I'm going to pause I have some questions for you, but I'm going to pause right here and ask Kelly if any questions have been submitted. I can handle.
We don't have any questions at this time, Barbara.
Okay, great. All right. Well, keep them in mind and keep submitting them when you have them. But for now, let me ask you some of these questions for your own planning. So I've given you your state rate, but we all know that your states are large and diverse. And so your county rate may be far more relevant than your state rate, or a region that you serve, maybe an urban area, or maybe you're urban and rural. That's really important to understand what the patterns are there. Cana can help you in some cases. We collect county data, but you can get that directly from your state or even your municipalities sometimes too. Then it's, I challenge you to think about, if you're not already tracking this, what is your market share of that rate? Is it what you want it to be? And then further break that down to cremation and burial. What is your cremation profitability? There's a lot of different ratios to determine that, revenue per case, that kind of thing. You'll have to determine what that means for you. But if you're not currently tracking that, it might make sense to do so, because as the cremation rate has climbed in other areas, people realize, your colleagues in other states have realized, I'm subsidizing cremation with my burial cases, and now my cremation cases are higher than my burial cases. I'm upside down. I have to change my business planning here. I have to change my pricing, that kind of thing. So you have the advantage of, generally speaking, of having a lower than 50% cremation rate for the most part. You have time to figure this out. So it's important to do that now and to think through, is this sustainable into the future? Some other questions to reflect on that I think we were talking about in trade publications and wondering about. No one has any answers, but we need to think through these things and engage with. I encourage you to engage with your community about some of these. I mean, have we, because of closures and restrictions, have we trained grieving families to choose direct disposition, and then they have to do the services on their own? I certainly hope not. I certainly hope the answer to that is nope. People realized what they missed, and they want their expert funeral director guiding them through this. They want beautiful facilities. They want larger gatherings. They want what they couldn't have and they want that in the future. But I think it's very important for each of you and for the associations that serve you to continue raising the profile of funeral service, to remind the broader general public that, oh yeah, we have experts to help you through this. You do not have to do it yourself like you did in 2020. The next question, number 6, have the 2020 deaths largely undermined profitability over the next 5 years? Another way to phrase that is, the deaths in 2020 were labeled excess deaths by the CDC, meaning before their time, meaning earlier than expected. And yes, most of the deaths were older people, 65 and older. Some were younger. But what is that going to mean for our markets, our regions over the next 5 years? Are death rates going to potentially plateau or even decline in some regions? And right now, demographers, state demographers, and other analysts are saying, yes, that is quite possible. And that's challenging because we have a mindset. It's challenging for me. I have a mindset of, wow, baby boomers, the biggest generation, is aging, and the peak of their deaths is anticipated to be between 2035 and 2040. Okay, we've got some time, but what if there's this unexpected trough in the next 5 years, because the oldest and sickest of those baby boomers and everybody have died prematurely? So it's something to keep in mind and plan for, and track, track with your calls to see, it impacts staffing, it impacts, so many things, right? So it's something to look for to see if that's going to happen, and to prepare your business for the future. Okay, great. Excuse me, we're exiting the statistics portion of the presentation, and all of this is good, right? All of this is fine. It's steady, predictable, anticlimactic. Now you've heard me confess that late last year, I thought cremation rate was going to perhaps double or triple. I'm quoted in newspapers saying that, the New York Times, etc., saying that, and I was wrong. I was wrong. It turns out that this consumer-driven trend of cremation growth is more steady and predictable and persistent than we thought. Fine. So, but 5 years ago, when we embarked on the Milestone Project, we were looking forward to the cremation rate hitting 50% nationally, and it did so in 2016. And so we decided then to understand more about how cremation rates grow differently in different parts of the country, and therefore what can we expect in the future, and also why people are choosing cremation. So the first finding from the Milestone Project was we capture in the speedometer image. So it took 100 years from the first cremation in 1876 for the cremation rate to hit 5% nationally in 1972. And then you can see the chunks of time where it's hit different percentages. So we're exiting rapid growth, going into deceleration in much of the country. And about a third of the country, they're in deceleration heading into plateau. So what does this mean at different phases? This means that there's various times, to plan for and adjust business models and service offerings and things like that. But it's also helpful to understand that in no way has cremation ever grown in a straight line. There's a pattern to this, and it largely looks like this. What we also tried to understand with the Milestone Project, there we go, like I said, is more about why. And up until this point, research as to why people are choosing cremation was based on product sales, or it was based on consumer interviews about what they plan to do in the future. That's all useful, but we wanted something that was more data-driven for decision making. And so what we did is we looked at census demographics from 2010 and compared it to cremation rates in 2012. And we took, our consultant did something called principal component analysis, and he took all these demographics and correlated them with cremation, higher cremation rates, lower cremation rates, and tried to paint a picture of the demographics of communities where cremation rates are growing faster and where cremation rates are growing slower. So some of the things I remember when I started with Cana 10 years ago, I was told things like the Bible Belt doesn't cremate as fast. That's why Mississippi, et cetera, is the lowest state. Or Black people don't really cremate. African American communities don't really cremate at the same rates as other communities. Okay. The shorter the driveway, the shorter the longer the driveway, the shorter the service, was something I heard from a California member, meaning, I guess, more wealth, bigger house, less, more likely direct disposition. And so these are the kinds of things we wanted to test. These are things we say to each other, we joke about or not joke about, we just understand to be true. But how could we validate all of that? So this research showed us that there really are kind of two distinct communities. And if you're involved in and interested in marketing, this was kind of research to support marketing messages. And what we discovered is, yep, women are still the decision makers by and large, and they're the ones introducing the conversation around planning for just any disposition, but often the ones to consider cremation for the first time. And there are these two communities. One we called the rooted community, and the census demographics that kind of grouped together around in the states with the lower growth of cremation rates were the ones you see on the screen. More manufacturing and agriculture, higher adherence to Christianity in particular and religion in general, overall lower education and income rates, high home ownership but lower home value. And all of that kind of led to this greater sense of community, lower transients. People aren't moving. If you own your home, you don't move as frequently as if you rent an apartment, for example. And so these were, the research revealed that these were elements that that correlated with slower cremation growth. Now, the cremation rate was still increasing, but if you think of that speedometer, it was just gaining speed, right? It was still in the kind of blue range. And what this also provided was an opportunity, what this leads to for you to understand is an opportunity to emphasize services in marketing, opportunity to promote, a relationship with your local cemetery, because maybe multiple generations of these families are buried in that cemetery, and maybe they're interested in burying cremated remains in that cemetery too. But they're likely to have a gathering. They're likely to reflect that commitment to their community with something in your funeral home. Okay. The other community we called a roaming community, and what we saw were many more small businesses and women-owned businesses. Overall, less of a religious affiliation. You've heard about the nuns, right? The NONESs. In the last Pew Religious Landscape Study, which I believe was 2016, they found that fully a third of Americans did not express an affiliation with any organized religion. They know what they don't want, but they know they don't want religion, but they are creating new traditions in many cases when it comes to celebrations of life or other things like that. Overall, these communities that had higher cremation growth rates had higher income and education, more apartments, more transients, and tended to be areas of the country where there were more urban areas, or think college towns, that kind of thing, where there's a lot of kind of people moving in and out for school, for work, for whatever. And so in these communities, what we learned from these demographics in this community, this roaming community, is it's more of an opportunity to emphasize personalization. So maybe the place is less important to them. The place is where they are now, but the life of the person who died is extremely important to them. And so having a more personal experience and opportunity to participate, that kind of thing is really valuable. So I'm liking posing questions to you. So this slide is, are you prepared to serve really both communities? Because I'm guessing all of you on this webinar realized, wait, I serve both rooted and roaming people all the time. I'm getting phone calls from the children, Gen X children who live elsewhere in the country or even overseas, who are like looking for plans for their parent or grandparent who lives in my community, right? You're getting those inquiries. You're getting you have to be both, and you have to talk to both of these communities. So I've put some tips up here on this slide about some of the things that our research showed that roaming customers, based on their demographics and behaviors, what they may look for. So they may look to your website for online pricing and examples of services that you can provide. Virtual tours, could help that. Online shopping or catalog, of urns. Things that demonstrate what you do and what you offer for cremation could be well received by roaming customers, because they're looking to your website for a phone number, right? Or to email you, chances are. So having an FAQ, even if you don't want to build out everything else, that says, what cremation services you offer and answer some of their questions, can be really useful in educating them. And they might be looking for referrals to other resources they may need while planning something with you. And of course, you can give those to them when you talk to them, right? Of course, you're going to offer the referrals that they may need. But again, they're kind of browsing online before shopping with you often. And so showing on your website or showing in your promotional materials, showing in your Facebook or social media posts that you're doing unique things that remember, these are the customers that aren't looking for religious liturgy, or creating new traditions and want to do that with you. So there's a wide range of things you can do here. And if some of you are on here thinking, I can't be bothered with all of that, it's just me, or it's a small staff, like what can I possibly do? Maybe I can't serve them at all. One other thing to think about is celebrants. If you're not currently working with a celebrant, or even have one on staff, consider finding one locally, because roaming customers, celebrants meet their needs precisely. They're listening to them. They're creating a new service offering, that's highly personalized, etc. So celebrants can be a great partner to serve these roaming customers. Rooted customers look for a lot of the things that you're likely currently offering, and they may be with the more comfortable families that you're serving. But they're also looking for coordination with the cemetery. They don't necessarily see funeral homes and cemeteries and urn manufacturers, whatever, to be separate entities. They expect this kind of seamless experience, right? And so they may be looking for some coordination services for you, which you likely already offer. Because they're in the community with you, they're looking for community engagement, which you're already doing. You're in the community too, you're a good citizen. So they may be looking for that on your website or social media. And they obviously may be looking for funeral homes that have strong relationships with their congregation. And so, when we hear about phone shoppers, my sense is that the phone shoppers fall more into the roaming category than the rooted category. The rooted, know you and through word of mouth or recommendation are going to find you. But I challenge all of you to think about how you're serving both communities, and to think about if there's ways that you can improve what you're offering them. And then the last research study I'm going to talk about is one we did in the spring of 2019 with Homesteaders Life Company. And these were focus groups. So we held 6 groups in Phoenix and Nashville. We focused on leading edge boomer women, which is the euphemism for older boomer women. My mother, who is in this group, did not enjoy being called leading edge, I will say. But anyway, in marketing terms, there's a piece of jargon for everything. And so we were looking for women who had selected cremation at some point within the last 3 years, not too recently, because we didn't want to, have this become like a grief support group. We wanted them to be able to talk about their experience without triggering any kind of recent trauma. We also wanted to exclude the notion that people are choosing cremation because that's all they can afford. And so we chose participants who had household incomes over $20,000, and most had incomes well over $20,000. So for some, we know cremation is kind of a default because that's what they can afford. We saw a lot of that over the past year and a half, and it was prevalent before. But for this research, we didn't want that to influence it. What we set out to do with this research is to challenge assumptions and biases. And one of the first things we encounter was one of our own assumptions that we ran into, which is we asked the facilitators for these focus groups, and if you've ever done or participated in focus groups or even seen it on TV, you know there are facilities with the one-way glass. So I was sitting on one side of the glass and the women talking were on the other side. They couldn't see me. And the facility actually selects people. They screen people for the client, in this case for Cana. And so we asked the facility to find people who had done direct cremation, which we described as cremation without services, and people who had done cremation with services. And about a week or so into the process, they came back to us and said, we need help because we've surveyed our entire database and people are interested in talking. There's no problem getting people to populate the focus groups. We're not finding anyone who did nothing. Everybody did something. And we realized that we'd made a false assumption right there, that of course they did something. What we really meant, what Cana and homesteaders really meant was we needed people who'd done chosen cremation and done services themselves, and then people who had chosen cremation and hired a funeral director or held services in a funeral home or a church with a funeral director's help. And that was the distinction. And after we overcame our own bias and jargon, we were able to populate the groups easily, and we had some robust discussions. I'm going to jump to the findings of this research, and we were trying to answer the question: what is cremation for these women? And they told us stories. And we have video of these focus groups, which are really compelling. But what we learned is that cremation is not the opposite of burial. Most of them buried cremated remains. They had no problem putting cremated remains in the ground, especially if they already had owned spaces at a cemetery. Excuse me. It was the opposite of maybe a body on display. It was the opposite of maybe embalming. It was the opposite of maybe a public display of grief that they weren't as interested in participating in. But it wasn't, they weren't rejecting burial or memorialization. It also wasn't less than. They didn't choose it because they didn't care. They didn't choose it because they didn't have the money. They weren't trying to avoid grieving at all. They were sad. They missed their husbands and children and parents. But that also related to this, they were trying to lessen or shorten or avoid altogether public displays of grief. They remembered being kids and having to walk by the open casket and see people crying in public and hear people talk about, are they grieving enough, and all this kind of thing. They told these stories of funeral experiences that they themselves didn't like and were rejecting. They certainly didn't regret choosing cremation, and it was not about the lowest price for them. It was about value. They saw value in cremation because it was what their family member wanted. They were good consumers. They could personalize. They could keep cremated remains. They could make decisions on a different timeline. It felt simpler to them because they could stretch out the timeline and have the disposition taken care of immediately, maybe with a small gathering and a viewing, and then later on gather and have a celebration of life or gathering around a scattering. So a lot of things we've all heard, right? A lot of things we've heard from families, but it was interesting to hear how unified and what consensus there was among these focus group women and their experience. And ultimately what we discovered that cremation is is a simpler way to deal with a disposition of the body. And this was, I'm going to pause on this for a second because this is really hard to hear. I mean, I've already told you that the women in this focus group, by and large, rejected embalming. And now what they're saying is they, by and large, had one problem they couldn't solve themselves. And that was this body. They needed to work with a funeral director to do that. Most were happy to do so. They recognized funeral directors as experts. They didn't want to do it themselves. They might want to throw a party or feed their family themselves, and not cater, but they certainly didn't want to do this themselves. But the question rose, did they need a funeral director to do anything else? And one woman said, well, I got copies of the death certificates, and that was certainly convenient and helpful. And the funeral director even helped me, with phone numbers to contact Social Security and all these. That was really great. I didn't expect that. I didn't expect the kind of additional services that the funeral director gave them. They kind of came in with this idea, this notion that they needed their cremation and they didn't know what else to ask for. So simple to them was not price. It was fewer decisions. It was maybe less public. They could grieve more privately. And it was also a focus on the life lived of the person versus their body on display. So cremation is also more flexible for many of the reasons I just referenced. And it was less expensive, so they felt good about being, good consumers and better use of resources. Overall, they reported that it was less stressful, again, tying back to that public performance, or that they could keep it within the family, they could control, who was involved, they could somehow talk more openly about death, which was interesting. One of the women, a couple of the women said that. And they felt the strong connection to the deceased through cremation, mainly through possession. They can have cremated remains at home with them. And that was one of my hypotheses. I don't know if I can ever prove it. So I may always wonder, but if that's why, especially in your region of the country in the early months of the pandemic, why the numbers of cremations jumped, is because these were unexpected, unplanned for deaths. Money did matter, of course, but they couldn't have the gatherings, they couldn't have the things they wanted, but they could, if they chose cremation, bring that urn home with them. They could keep that loved one with them, a little bit longer until they made plans for permanent memorialization or until they scattered. So, that connection, we cannot underestimate how important that connection is to the families you serve, and cremation in their minds and as they report it provides a stronger connection. But also what we learned through this research is that they didn't always know what cremation was. They struggled to describe it. We would have focus groups of 5 or 6 women, so that's not a lot of people telling stories, but there was a high level of like I said, consensus and kind of reinforcement of different themes. But I would also say that in each of the focus groups, one woman would tell her story and another would say, I didn't know you could do that. How did you find out about that? Cremation jewelry, what? I didn't even know about that. Or, I was scared to take the ashes on the plane. And another one saying, oh, the funeral director told me what to expect. And so there was this very diverse experience of well, I chose it. I did the best research I could at the time. I'm satisfied with our choice. But what? There's more you can do? And so cremation is somewhat unknown and still evolving in their minds. So that can be both an opportunity and also a frustration, I expect, working with people who know exactly what they don't want, but not necessarily what they do. So that's a challenge for you to embrace. I'm winding up now, so now's the time to start formulating and submitting your questions if you haven't already. But I have a few more slides and then we'll open it up. I want to give you kind of 3 tips about price. I promise this isn't in violation of any FTC rules to my association colleagues on here. But I've had conversations with some of you in CANA members in these states that you're in, and you might be on the webinars thinking, okay, if I'm going to compete with cremation providers, I got to lower my prices. You jump to lowering prices. I don't want to tell you how to run your business, but I hope that this presentation, that this data, that some of the things I presented to you help you rethink your assumptions, because it's not always about lowering prices. It is always about value, perceived value in what you're offering them. Always, even if they say it's about price. Price shoppers are really looking for value, always. So please take that with you. I've recently learned the name of a concept that apparently this was named more than 10 years ago, but explore equalization, meaning look at your GPL, look at your service offerings and see, are you really treating grieving families as grieving families? Or do you have some assumptions about burial families versus cremation families? Is cremation less than in your mind? And is that spilling over to the families you serve? So for example, if in an arrangement, if the first question you ask is, will it be cremation or burial? Considering holding off on that question till the end and talk about, how do you want to celebrate this person's life? How do you want to, tell me about your mom, your dad, your husband, your wife. Open it up with some open questions and then get to disposition later. But if somehow that's the first question you ask and you realize that it's taking you down a path of making other decisions, rethink that, please, and explore treating, equalization. That can also go to your business model, because if you learn after reflecting on this that maybe your burial prices are subsidizing your cremation prices, that's not a long-term solution. So that's complex, but that leads to my third point: make data-driven decisions. Okay, you've got new competition. Don't lower your prices without understanding if you can afford to. There may be another solution, another path. It's my very favorite quote ever, so I'll leave you with hopefully a little chuckle. It always makes me smile. And some key takeaways. So if anything we've learned, and myself included, over the last year and a half, we need to base decisions at least as much on numbers as on feelings. We're still making our way through this pandemic. We're still making the best, weighing the risks and rewards of all sorts of things. I think all of your associations have meetings coming up, and we were chatting a little bit before this started, like, when have we ever asked our members to consider risking their lives to come to a meeting? The answer is never. And then that's a little bit of hyperbole, I realize. But everything's harder in a pandemic, and we just have to give ourselves some grace and understand that. But don't ignore the numbers when making decisions and rely just on your gut and your feelings. That's important. But please look at the numbers too. Always remember that consumers are absolutely driving cremation rates. Consumers, the families you serve, pop culture, general public, whatever definition of consumer, I say consumers here, but you can define it whichever way you want, they are driving cremation rates. I would like to say I'm that amazing as the executive director of CANA that we are increasing cremation rates year over year. We're not. We're chasing consumer trends just like you are. We're just describing them. So hopefully you can learn from them. So consumers are 100% in charge. And then there's a wide variety. You can't be all things to all people. So there's a wide variety of things you can offer on this, what I describe here as the cremation continuum. You may never want to offer low-cost cremations, right, or direct cremations, but the FTC requires it, so you'll have it on your GPL. But you'll add value, and you'll talk about that value, and that's great. That's exactly, but you need to think about where you want to be on that continuum, where you want to be with roaming and rooted consumers, and be intentional about that. Don't fall into the trap of trying to be all things to all people. And I've said this repeatedly throughout, but please rethink your opinions, biases, ignorance. We all have them. I confess to mine. I confront them every day. But rethink all of that as you approach families. Okay. That is the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention. And Kelly, could you share any questions that may have come, please?
Sure. So the first question is a two-part question. Do you feel new forms of disposition, such as natural organic reduction and alkaline hydrolysis, will have an impact on cremation? Does the negative environmental impact from cremation affect the growth of these alternatives?
Okay, great. Okay, there's a lot there. So let me unpack that a little bit. So first of all, in the 20 states where alkaline hydrolysis is legal, 19 of them count it as cremation. So the figures I showed you, Minnesota, Illinois, I can't list them all actually from memory, but all those states that except for Washington state, Washington is the outlier, that have alkaline hydrolysis businesses running, their cases are counted as cremation cases and reported in the statistics. Washington has a different regulatory structure, so we will be able to count alkaline hydrolysis separately. That said, we look at that every year. We look at those 20 states and to see, okay, alkaline hydrolysis are up and running in almost all of them. Is the cremation rate going faster? Has it slowed down? Do we see any change? And the answer is not yet. So stay tuned. We will report on that if we ever see a jump. But certainly, it's driving the cremation rate increase. There's no doubt, because alkaline hydrolysis has been quite popular. Now, as far as natural organic reduction, it's most recently legal in Washington and now in Colorado and Oregon, and California is expected to pass a bill this year. So 3 states allow for it. The 4th state may be coming, and so we'll see, right? Those are going to be 2021 numbers. Actually, there were a few processes in late 2020 in Washington state, but I'm eager to see the 2021 disposition numbers. It is clear to me that natural organic reduction is not cremation. It will not be counted in the cremation numbers, but it's kind of being treated as green burial in those states. So what I'm less clear on is, will it have its own disposition category and be reported as such, or will it be lumped in as burial? So just a little insight into what we're anticipating for next year's report. And Cremation is a real interesting concept, but is not a reality. Nobody yet has been able to to create a machine that actually does it. And for those of you who don't know what cremation is, it's freeze drying bodies, shaking them to break into small parts, running hot water over them, I think, and then it becomes this kind of like not quite cremated, probably like cremated remains, I guess, larger chunks that can then be processed. But it's purely a concept, and the Swedish woman, whose name escapes me at the moment, who conceived of it, and she's a lot of evangelists around the country who love the notion of it. Well, she just died last year, and even in Sweden, it wasn't a reality. So stay tuned. There was something. There's some news story in Kansas around this if you're interested in learning more, but it's not. It doesn't actually exist. And then your last question, Kelly, if I'm remembering correct, was the environment. Like, can you just read the last question? I want to make sure I got it right.
Yeah, sure. So do you think the negative, I took it off my screen, but the negative environmental impact surrounding cremation, do you think that'll make other options more popular?
Yeah, this is so fascinating to me because we, one of my staff persons just told me this morning, I wrote a blog post a few months ago about the environmental impact of cremation, because there was a lot of misinformation out there. There's an infographic nobody can cite the source for that says, it's you can, one cremation is as much fuel as driving cross country, or like all these inflated things. So being data driven, I said, I can figure this out. And I contacted a few crematory manufacturers and a few members, and I said, how much natural gas is actually spent on a cremation? Of course, it depends. You can read the blog post. And it is now the fourth most read blog post, fourth most popular blog post. It's just a few months old, of all of our blogs, our blog posts. So it's people are reading it and people are referencing it. I think it's unfortunate that there are CANA members who are alkaline hydrolysis manufacturers or businesses who are kind of choosing a bash cremation marketing strategy when selling their products and services. But it's a choice, and it's effective apparently. But there's an environmental impact of everything that we do. And so it all boils down to, what's more important than not. I dodged the question, if you didn't notice, Kelly, so now I'm going to answer it. I don't believe that the environmental impact of cremation is going to slow down the cremation rate. I think it's better known and quantified now. I think people are thinking about their footprint on this earth more. And if anything will slow down the cremation rate, it's green burial. And that's something we've learned both through research and also our educational programming is that cremation is often a fallback position, meaning consumers really interested in green burial, but it's not feasible. There's no green burial cemetery close by. They'd have to ship out of state. Well, you can't do that without embalming, so then you can't have a green burial. You can imagine how the decision making, they start doing their research and they quickly realize, oh, that's really not going to happen. And so they choose cremation. But as more cemeteries or green burial offer green burial services and are certified by the Green Burial Conference, and existing cemeteries become hybrid operations, it could really impact the cremation rate. And then I'll also say body donation has already caused a premature plateau of the cremation rate in Arizona. They're hovering just under 70%, and about 20% of disposition in that state is body donation. So that body donation and green burial are likely the ones to impact any disposition growth. It's a long answer, sorry. All right, we're at our time, but can we do one more question maybe?
Sure, I can do one more. Do you think that weak funeral directors and poor embalmers have anything to do with the rising cremation rate?
I think consumers are driving at 100%. And so therefore, if they had bad experiences with embalming or funeral directing, maybe, but honestly, I think it's more pop culture driven, that funeral directors too often are depicted as creepy or money grubbing, or, on the other end of things, if you're a Hallmark movie fan, nobody ever gets buried in a Hallmark movie. They're all cremated. I guess it's because they're all filmed in Canada. I don't know. But cremation is just depicted as the thing to do. And increasingly it is what people are doing. So no, I'm not going to blame bad embalmers or funeral directors, but I think, in fact, I have great empathy, because I think they're for you, because consumers all of a sudden, and it really feels like all of a sudden, don't want what you've offered all this time. And obviously not all of them, but a portion of the consumers are rejecting, what you have to offer. And it's a scramble. It's difficult to change direction or to do different things for some families than others. but that's what's required. The audience is becoming more segmented and more what they want. But no, consumers are driving this for sure. All right. I can stay on as long as you need, but I want to be respectful of people's time too. So if there are more
That's
questions.
actually the end of the questions, Barbara.
Oh, great. There we go. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you for your attention. You can contact me with things on here. I really appreciate the invitation to speak to your group and wish you all well.
Barbara, this is Margie Nolan. That is a lot of information for 1 hour. Thank you so much. I learned so much when we are together, and we greatly appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to be with us here today. I want to remind all the participants to refer to your state association for information on your CEU or APFSP credits. I also want to take advantage of Barbara's reference to celebrant training to put in a little ad for the Northeast Funeral Service Partnership has entered into an agreement to offer celebrant training on a regular basis within all of our states in the region. So watch for information from your state associations about that. And that will be going forward for the next 4 to 5 years. Also, we want to say, everybody, thank you again and have a great afternoon. The seminar is concluded.